In last week's video, I looked at some of the terrible F1 teams that entered races but failed to make a start due to not being able to get through qualifying. In this week's edition, we'll be looking at the teams that managed to jump over the bar of qualifying but couldn't pole vault into a point-scoring position. Just like before where we saw a small handful of teams enter only one race, there have been a good portion of teams who have entered several races but only made a solitary race start. The most famous, or probably the most infamous in this case, is the Andrea Moda team that raced for 12 races during the 1992 season. Known for being ran into the ground by a lunatic mafia boss who was so hell-bent on replacing one of his drivers that he practically committed attempted murder in the team's last F1 appearance at an F1 weekend. That's just one example of the inner workings of Andrea Moda being one of the worst ran teams in F1 history, and many other YouTubers have done a much better job at documenting Andrea Sassetti's team than I have here, but that's because I want to investigate some of the other teams who started races but failed to score any points. The first team I'd like to discuss in detail is the Token Racing team that entered 4 races in the 1974 Formula 1 season. Ron Dennis's F2 team needed extra sponsorship to move up to Formula 1, and they got backing from French oil company Motul, but thanks to the 1973 energy crisis, the sponsorship money that came from him wasn't enough. Two investors from the team's F2 days, Tony Vasopoulos and Ken Grob, decided to run the half-developed car, designed by Ray Jessup under their own team name, and thus the Token team was born from the first 2 letters of Vasopoulos' and Grob's first names, Tony and Ken. After debuting at a non-championship race in Silverstone, the team entered its first F1 race in Nivelle Ballers, with Welshman Tom Price at the wheel of their singular chassis. He qualified in 20th place, 3 seconds off the pole sitter Niki Lauda, however he retired due to a collision on lap 66 of 85. The team then sat out the next 4 races, but returned for the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch. David Purley was hired to drive the car, replacing Price, however he only qualified in 26th place. As only 25 cars were allowed to start the race, Purley was listed as a did not qualify and obviously didn't start the race. They entered the next race at the Nürburgring Nordschleife, but had a third different driver in 3 races that they entered. Ian Ashley was a British racing driver born in West Germany and was making his Formula 1 debut. Initially, Ashley failed to qualify in 26th place, 24 seconds away from pole position, but he was allowed to start the race on race day. During the race, Ashley was the only driver to be lapped and finished in last place of those who crossed the line under their own power in 14th. After a pretty big failure in Germany, Ashley stayed on for the race at the Österreichring. In this Austrian Grand Prix, Ashley qualified 24th and 3.2 seconds away from pole position, and then was not classified during the race as he finished 8 laps down on the winner due to tyre problems. The team shut down having run out of money, and the team inspired by Ron Dennis was now off of the F1 grid. Token weren't necessarily a bad team, they were just underfunded and lost their main asset thanks to overzealous owners who thought they could tackle F1 on their own without Ron Dennis. So, Token Racing started the Formula 1 journey of one of the sport's most well-known team principals, but what about a team that tried again? Let's get into a juicier story. Which team had the most race entries without any points? Enzo Coloni founded an eponymous team called Scuderia Coloni in 1983, and after spending 4 years in Formula 3 and Formula 3000, he joined the F1 grid in 1987. Thanks to cost-cutting measures by the FIA banning turbocharged engines post-1988, Coloni thought his team would be able to step up and be competitive in Formula 1 and wanted to get some experience running the team before the turbo ban. An ex-Dallara designer, Roberto Ori, designed the Coloni chassis, and Nicola Larini was hired to drive the single-car entry. The car wasn't ready until the Italian Grand Prix, and Larini was one of 28 drivers attempting to qualify for a 26-car race at Monza, but the all-Italian entry bar the Cosworth engine failed to qualify in 27th place, 12 seconds off poleman Nelson Piquet. After missing the Portuguese Grand Prix, they decided to enter the Spanish Grand Prix at Jerez. Larini out-qualified both the sellers and he started the race in 26th place. Unfortunately, he was the first driver to retire from the race due to suspension issues, but it was a race start nonetheless. The team then missed the 3 flyaway races at the end of the 1987 season in Mexico, Japan and Australia. For 1988, they made some minor updates to their single chassis and hired Gabriele Tarquini from the Acela team as Larini went the other way. The team would start the season by qualifying for all of the first 5 races of the season. Despite qualifying reasonably well, Tarquini retired from the opening 3 of his 5 races due to suspension or fuel system issues, but managed to record Coloni's first race finish in Mexico by finishing 14th, 5 laps down on race winner Alain Prost. Then in Canada, Tarquini finished 8th and 2 laps down, achieving the team's best result so far. Following the dizzying heights of a top 8 finish, Tarquini then failed to get out of pre-qualifying in every one of the next 4 races in Detroit, Paul Ricard, Silverstone and Hockenheim. He then took 13th in Hungary, but after starting 22nd in Spa, he was not classified as he finished 7 laps down on race winner Ayrton Senna's McLaren. After surpassing pre-qualifying in Monza, Tarquini failed to break into the top 26 cars in the 30-car qualifying session and thus failed to qualify, although the Coloni chassis had clearly majorly improved as his time during that qualifying session was 3 seconds faster than Laurini's time from the Italian Grand Prix the year before. Tarquini squeezed onto the starting grid in 26th in Estoril and finished the race in 11th, 5 laps down and only ahead of Nicola Laurini's Asella on track. The Portuguese race was the last one that Tarquini qualified for in 1988 because in the third to last and the penultimate races of the year in Jerez and Suzuka, he didn't get out of pre-qualifying. Then in the last race of the year in Adelaide, he got out of pre-qualifying, but in the main qualifying session he finished 27th and missed out on the magical 26th place needed to qualify by a mere tenth of a second. In his first 2 years, Coloni had ran a singular chassis. However, for 1989 they expanded to a 2-car outfit. They hired Brazilian Roberto Moreno and Frenchman Pierre-Henri Raffanel to drive the cars. Moreno had entered 1 race for Lotus in 1982 and the last 2 races of the 1987 season for the AGS team, picking up the team's only points finish of the year. He has now become a meme in the Formula 1 community due to the fact that he has drove for a handful of dog-shit teams over his career and often dragged the cars he drove to places they never should have been. His teammate Raffanel, however, had only 1 F1 entry to his name before 1989 at the back end of the 1988 season driving for Lotus, another minnow. Coloni was his first full-time F1 drive. Driving a barely updated 2-year-old design, Moreno did not qualify for either of the opening 2 races in Brazil and Imola, and Raffanel didn't even pre-qualify for either. Monaco mitigated the car's lack of straight-line speed, and Raffanel qualified 18th, with Moreno 25th, although both drivers retired during the race with gearbox failure. After Mexico and Phoenix saw Moreno fail to qualify with Raffanel back to not pre-qualifying, for the round following in Canada, Moreno actually managed to qualify. He lined up in the final grid spot in 26th, but retired from the race with 12 laps to go, with differential failure. Meanwhile, Raffanel failed to pre-qualify. Both cars failed to start in Paul Ricard, then in Silverstone, Moreno was again the only Coloni car to get onto the grid in 23rd place. He retired on lap 2 with gearbox failure. After the Silverstone race, there was a shake-up in the way that pre-qualifying was held, as Moreno would also now have to do pre-qualifying with Raffanel. He didn't have to before, but Minardi scored 3 points in Silverstone to put their fellow Italian minnows Coloni into the dreaded Friday morning session. Moreno and Raffanel both failed to pre-qualify in both Hockenheim and Hungary. After the race at the Hungaroring, Raffanel, who at the time had only qualified for 1 race compared to Moreno's 3, was dropped from the team in favour of Italian rookie and unsuccessful Junior Series driver Enrico Bertaggia. It was a baptism of fire for the new boy, as he and Moreno failed to escape pre-qualifying in Spa and Monza. Then in Estoril, Moreno dragged the car into 15th place on the grid but retired on lap 11 due to electrical failure. The team then failed to pre-qualify for any of the last 3 races of the 1989 season in Jerez, Suzuka and Adelaide. Then for the 1990 season, strapped for cash, the Coloni team took on substantial financial backing from Subaru, who cleared the team's debts and supplied them with a flat 12 engine to use during the races. The engine was severely underpowered and the chassis was about 140 kilograms heavier than the rest of the grid. They also downsized from a 2-car operation to only run 1 chassis, driven by future chemical weapons user Bertrand Gachot through the entire season. For the first 8 races, Gachot failed to get out of pre-qualifying, then once the chassis was updated and the engine was changed from a Subaru to a Ford Cosworth, the results improved. Subaru didn't see satisfactory results from the team, however, and so pulled out of the operation after only 8 races. After an abysmal 13-race failure to pre-qualify streak, Gachot dragged the car out of pre-qualifying in every single remaining race following the Belgian Grand Prix that season. Unfortunately for Gachot, despite getting into the main qualifying session 6 times, he never got higher than 30th place and thus never got onto the grid for a race that season. Struggling with money, Enzo Coloni gave a C3C chassis from the 1990 season to the students on aerodynamics-related courses at the University of Perugia to do some detailing work on the chassis that had been mostly underdeveloped for 2 years now. This would also be the last time in F1 history that a team ran only 1 chassis for the duration of a Formula 1 season. The newly christened C4 chassis bombed on track. As driven by British Formula 3000 champion Pedro Chavez, it failed to get out of pre-qualifying in all of the first 13 rounds of the season. After such a disappointing endeavour, Chavez left the team and left Coloni without a driver for the 14th round of the season at the brand new Circuit de Catalunya in Spain. Japanese driver Naoki Hattori was drafted in for the final 2 races, but just as previously, couldn't get out of pre-qualifying. After having failed to qualify for a total of 67 races and on a 34-race streak of not qualifying, Coloni sold his team of 6 staff and 1 chassis to Andrea Sassetti, who would transform the team into Andrea Moda and proceed to run the team into the ground through mismanagement. To expand on my introduction paragraph from earlier, Sassetti neglected his second driver, Perry McCarthy, after the FIA didn't permit for the team to constantly chop and change drivers. Sassetti basically played mind games with McCarthy in an attempt to get him to leave of his own volition instead of firing him, which would have been cock-blocked by the FIA. Such mind games included giving him an ill-fitting seat at the Monaco Grand Prix weekend, which on the bumpy street circuit would have made his vision blurry and impossible to drive quickly. Then at Silverstone he was sent out on wet tyres on a fully dry track in order to leave the fresh slicks for his teammate Roberto Moreno. The Hungarian race in Budapest saw his mechanics only send him out the pits with 45 seconds remaining in the pre-qualifying session, therefore making it impossible for him to set a lap time. Then at the Belgian Grand Prix when McCarthy went Eau Rouge for the first time, the car nearly failed to navigate the fast corner. On coming back to the pits to fix the issue, he was told that the mechanics knew of the fault with the steering column because it was previously on teammate Moreno's car. They had knowingly taken a flexing steering column and put it on his car and sent him out on track. Fearing for his life, McCarthy finally quit the team, but the team wouldn't last any longer as it was banned from all future FIA competitions for bringing the sport into disrepute by its actions. In its previous guise Coloni, the team was a plucky underdog who got a best result of 8th place and suffered from a lack of money rather than a lack of talent, and they were a product of their time. Just like Life, the team we mentioned last week, they were seriously underfunded and thus couldn't get off the ground really. It's a shame, because Enzo Coloni clearly had a lot of character and clearly knew what he was doing. To bring in a more recent and new flair, I think the last segment of this video is going to talk about the 3 new teams that came into F1 in 2010, Virgin, Lotus and Hispania. They initially came into the sport on the promise that they will be operating on a £40 million cost cap for all teams. However, when the major already established teams threatened to form a breakaway series, the FIA backed off and instead offered pitiful incentives to abide by an optional cost cap. Nonetheless, with the pullouts of major manufacturers such as Toyota, Honda and BMW post-2009, the 3 new teams would be a breath of fresh air. Initially, they were supposed to be joined by a 13th team, USF1, but after inspection of facilities by the late Charlie Whiting, they were found to be woefully underprepared and thus only Virgin, Lotus and Hispania made it onto the grid. There was a clear gaping chasm between the new boys and the rest of the grid in the opening race of the 2010 season on the Bahrain Endurance Circuit. 2.7 seconds separated the Virgin of Timo Glock in 19th and Jaime El Jaswari in 18th. Furthermore, the last place driver, Hispania's Karun Chandok, was 10.8 seconds off the pole position. Only the 2 Lotuses of Heikki Kovalainen and Jarno Trulli were classified in the race, and although Trulli did suffer from hydraulics failure on lap 46 of 49, Kovalainen finished 2 laps down in 15th place. The second race of the season in Melbourne was better as the gap from last place Chandok to pole was only 6 seconds compared to more than 10 seconds in the first race of the season, although the time gap between the fastest new team driver, Heikki Kovalainen, and the slowest established team driver was still more than 2 seconds. An attritional race saw 2 new team cars finish the race, with the Lotus of Kovalainen in 13th and Karun Chandok in 14th and last of the finishers. While every other driver remained on the lead lap, Kovalainen was 2 laps down and Chandok was 5 laps down on race winner Jenson Button by the end of the race. The season continued with the gaps to the leaders becoming closer and closer until the first big change happened with the new teams. Bruno Senna had been suspended by Hispania for the race in Silverstone for sending emails to other staff bad-mouthing team principal Colin Colles. Pay driver and future politician Sakon Yamamoto would join the team filling in for the Brazilian, but his lack of recent F1 experience showed. Having last raced during the 2007 season for Spiker, he came back to a new era of tyres and without refuelling. Nonetheless, he was only 4 tenths behind teammate Karun Chandok in qualifying. Yamamoto finished 20th behind Chandok, and then from the German Grand Prix onwards he would replace the Indian, supposedly pushed along by his £500,000 per race pay deal that he had with Hispania. The new teams continued to plod along, then Hispania would field their 4th driver of the season with an even more unlikely candidate than Yamamoto coming in. After the aforementioned Japaneseman contracted food poisoning, ex-Jaguar and Red Bull driver Christian Klein would join the team, after 4 years out of full-time Grand Prix competition. He actually outqualified his teammate Bruno Senna in his first race in Singapore by 1.2 seconds, having never driven the track before, although he was forced out of the race due to hydraulic issues. Timo Glock and Bruno Senna also achieved the magical 14th place as required to move their teams up in the Constructors' Championship in Japan, then in Korea. Meanwhile, Kovalainen took 12th place in Japan, meaning Lotus had all but secured 10th place in the Constructors, and more importantly, the money that went with it. Hispania and Virgin both had a best result of 2 14th places, but Hispania had 1 more 15th place than Virgin, so they took 11th in the Constructors despite having a worse car. Due to a lack of car development, the gap between the pole time at the last race in Abu Dhabi and the Hispanias on the back row was more than it was in the middle of the season, with 5 seconds separating Sebastian Vettel and Christian Klein. The Lotuses had caught up to the midfield teams, however, closing the gap between them from 2.7 seconds in Bahrain to 1.7 at the last race. Virgin were about half a second off Lotus but were well clear of Hispania performance-wise. They were just unreliable. For 2011, there were some changes in the air. Lotus kept their trusty lineup of 2 Grand Prix winners, while Virgin replaced Lucas di Grassi with Jerome D'Ambrosio, who hadn't had the best Junior Series record. Meanwhile, Hispania, or HRT as they were now known, had a complete lineup revamp. Senna, Chandok, Yamamoto and Klein were all gone, and in came ex-Jordan driver Narain Karthikeyan and karting legend Vitantonio Liuzzi. Something else of note was HRT's car design. Not in terms of aerodynamics, but the paintwork itself. The team had realised they weren't exactly flush with sponsors, so they hired an artist to basically make a very eloquent "Your logo here" design, with such phrases on the side pods and rear wings such as "This could be you" and "This is a cool spot." A very bizarre idea indeed. At the first race of the season in Australia, the Virgins filled up the back row while the Lotuses filled up the penultimate row of the grid in 19th and 20th places. But where are the HRTs? I hear you cry. Okay, maybe not cry, maybe just ask, but it's a valid point anyway. After Sebastian Vettel set a pole time over 1:23.529, the 107% time needed for everyone to pass to qualify was a 1:31.267. That sounds fair, because surely no one would be 8 seconds off the pace. Of course HRT would. Liuzzi was 9.4 seconds off pole. A mildly attritional race saw Trulli's Lotus finish 13th with D'Ambrosio in 14th and Glock not classified in 15th. At the next race in Sepang, both HRTs managed to qualify on the last row of the grid but retired with reliability issues in the race. The next interesting race came in Monaco, where, after damaging both cars in free practice, the HRT team had to be given permission from the FIA to start the race. Trulli also picked up his second 13th place of the season to all but secure Lotus's 10th place in the Constructors early on. Then at the Canadian Grand Prix, the longest race in F1 history, as both Lotuses faltered, the Hispanias took 13th and 14th to go ahead of Virgin in the Constructors, with Liuzzi leading Karthikeyan. Then at the European Grand Prix at Valencia next time out, HRT went from hero to zero as for the first time in 6 years, and for only the third time in history, if you don't include the 2005 US Grand Prix, every single starter finished the race. What's so odd about that, I hear you ask? Well, Narain Karthikeyan was the one who finished in last and took the record for the lowest finishing position of an F1 driver in a race ever, with 24th. From that race onwards, Karthikeyan will be dropped by HRT and replaced by Red Bull Junior Daniel Ricciardo. In his time at the team, he mostly just tried to learn from a more experienced Liuzzi, but moving away from HRT, Jarno Trulli will be replaced by Karun Chandok for one race at Hockenheim, a race where Chandok qualified as second off of his teammate Kovalainen, then finished last and 4 laps down on the race winner. Kovalainen then took the team's third 13th place finish of the season in Monza, and the only other thing of note towards the end of the season was in India. For the first race at the Bud International Circuit, Narain Karthikeyan was brought back for HRT. Obviously they were trying to buy local support for the team. He actually beat Ricciardo in the race, so that proves that Karthikeyan is clear of that Australian fraud and should be going to Red Bull next year to replace Sergio Perez and to absolutely decimate Max Verstappen, becoming the first Indian champion and proceed to call everyone a cucumber. Anyway, nothing really happened for the rest of the 2011 season, so let's move into 2012. This is where Virgin turns into Marussia after a buyout from the Russian car company, and since they did actually score points a few times in the remaining iteration of the team, we're going to have to end their story here in this video, because this video is for the teams who scored no points. Going back to Lotus and HRT, Lotus would become Caterham for 2012 after a naming dispute broke out between Colin Chapman's son and Tony Fernandez, owner of the Lotus F1 team. It was also very confusing that Renault had renamed themselves to Lotus Renault in 2011 and adopted a classic black and gold paint scheme, meaning that there were 2 Lotus teams on the grid now that were completely unrelated. Lotus F1, aka Shitty Green Lotus, became Caterham for 2012. Jarno Trulli decided to retire from F1 midway through the pre-season testing, and thus Caterham signed ex-Lotus Renault driver Vitaly Petrov. Also, Vitantonio Liuzzi retired before pre-season testing, and HRT signed the 41-year-old Pedro de la Rosa, and he became the Spanish team's first Spanish driver. At the first race of the 2012 season, again held in Australia, HRT again failed to qualify with both cars. Meanwhile, Kovalainen and Petrov retired from the race due to mechanical issues. Then in Malaysia, after rain fell after the race start, HRT had gambled on putting Karthikeyan on wet tyres, so when everyone else came into the pits for wets too, he was momentarily in 8th place, and when the red flag fell on lap 9, Karthikeyan would line up in 10th place on the restart, in the points. He fell back quickly from there, but later on in the race collided with Sebastian Vettel, which then led to Vettel calling Karthikeyan a cucumber after the race. Why he went for cucumber I don't know, but the nickname stuck and everyone now knows Narain as the cucumber. Monaco is the next important race. Although Marussia aren't supposed to be documented in this video, I will document their battle with Caterham for 10th in the Constructors' Championship that raged on throughout the season. At Monaco, the first major shift in Constructors' Championship hopes happened. Kovalainen took 13th, which usurped Timo Glock's 14th place from Russia in the season opener at Australia. Petrov, Kovalainen's teammate, then equalled his teammate's 13th in Valencia, but then Timo Glock took 12th place in Singapore to put Marussia back on top. HRT were practically out of the battle for the 10th in the Constructors by this point, with Carl-Kane's 15th in Monaco being their best result. Kovalainen then again took 13th in Abu Dhabi, but the battle went down to the last race in Brazil between Caterham and Marussia. Fuck the battle between Seb and Fernando for the title, this was more important. Just like Malaysia, there was early chaos which caused many drivers to fall down the pack. At one point, Kovalainen was in 6th place with Glock 7th and Petrov 8th. Carl-Kane ran up in the points early on too. However, they all slowly fell back, and towards the end of the race it was Charles Pics Marussia that ran in 11th place, which would have given his team 10th in the standings. However, he lost his position to Petrov late on, and it was Petrov who took the plaudits and the 10th place in the Constructors for Caterham. It was later found out, however, that Pic had lost the position to Petrov on purpose. This was because, although Pic was driving for Marussia in 2012, he had signed for Caterham in 2013. Thus, if he gave Petrov the position, he would screw over his current team in favour of giving his new team extra prize money. Marussia were obviously livid, but there was nothing they could do. Another team that could do nothing to stop their fate was HRT. They were strapped for cash, and the previous owners wanted to sell the team but couldn't find a buyer. Therefore, the team went out of business before 2013 came around. This meant that the only team I'm left to document is the rest of the Caterham story. As mentioned earlier, Charles Pic had signed for the team in 2013, and Heikki Kovalainen would be replaced by Guido van der Gaard. Despite the extra prize money coming from 2012, Caterham faltered in 2013. Marussia had signed Jules Bianchi, and after his 13th place in Sepang wasn't beaten by Caterham, the closest they got was 3 14th place finishes. Caterham finished behind Marussia in the standings. Van der Gaard had shown potential, such as in Monaco where he got into Q2 and narrowly missed out on Q3, but potential didn't translate into results. The Malaysian team then did a major revamp of the 2014 regulations in an attempt to beat Marussia. Gone were Pic and Van der Gaard, in came pay driver Marcus Ericsson and cult icon Kamui Kobayashi. They turned up in Australia with a car that looked uglier than your mum, and Kobayashi's brakes failed on the opening lap of the race at the first race of the season, and this meant he ploughed into the back of Felipe Massa's Williams. That one incident summed up Caterham's 2014 season. The Constructors' battle was wrapped up in Monaco when Bianchi took 9th place and 2 points. Kobayashi was actually ahead of Bianchi for a good part of the race, but the famous overtake at the Raskas saw Kamui take massive floor and side pod damage, and he fell back from Marussia. The Caterham team really struggled for money towards season's end, and Kobayashi was booted out so Andrea Moda could make his F1 debut at Spa, and so they could get money from Moda as sponsors. The debutant outqualified teammate Marcus Ericsson by a full second in his first ever qualifying session, which was obviously very embarrassing for the Swedish rookie, but then Moda retired early on in the race, but he wouldn't be the last driver that season that stepped into a Caterham for their first Grand Prix. After Caterham went into financial peril right at the back end of the season, they missed the rounds in Kota and Interlagos before coming back for one final hurrah in Abu Dhabi thanks to a successful crowdfunding campaign. Will Stevens paid £500,000 to make a premature debut ahead of his campaign with Manor in 2015. He wasn't embarrassed by Kobayashi in qualifying, but after the Japanese driver retired on lap 42 due to vibrations, Stevens finished last on track. Marussia were able to use the money from their 9th place Constructors finish to fund a campaign into 2015 and 2016, but Caterham went bust as they couldn't find any backing from anyone to fund a team. Of the 3 new teams, obviously we only saw Virgin and not its later iterations in this video, but they were probably the best team of the 3. Lotus were good, but Caterham was shit, and HRT was just shit in general. All of the teams were doomed from the moment the FIA withdrew the cost cap in 2009. They were operating on tiny budgets, with incompetent or experienced drivers and staff, and in a way, it's a miracle that some of them lasted as long as they did. Anyways, thanks everybody for tuning in. That completes this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. See you all next week when I will talk about the big budget manufacturers who had all the gear but no idea, like the likes of Toyota and Lamborghini. Furthermore, please go follow my Instagram, it's Nedzo_F1, or you can click the link in the description. And I've recently made a Patreon account where I'm going to post audio-only versions of the videos a day or two before they go live on YouTube. It will be $1, or 82 pence for us Brits, per month. So if you'd like to see the videos early, then that's what you should do. I'm not going to upload any videos exclusively to Patreon, nor will this affect my regular uploading schedule, so don't worry about that. With that being said, please like and subscribe to see more Formula 1 content from me. I've been Nedzo, and I'll see you all later. Bye!